Hello, this is Black and Indigenous American, and this video is going to be in regards to genealogy. And I know I have videos with different parts on genealogy, and it was pretty basic, but I wanted to focus a little bit more on other records that, in general, beginners don't know about, or they may glance through it, or a genealogist that has a lot of experience may say, oh, well, you can go here, and you really don't go to those records. You hear a lot about, regular census records and death records and military records and tax records and things of that nature. Many also hit a brick wall, including myself, in regards to the census records of 1890. Because apparently there was a fire and the records were destroyed, like 25% or something like that. And then a huge percent was damaged based on, the water for putting out the fire and smoke. So they pretty much say, you know what, forget about 1890. Don't worry about it. Just pick it up at 1900. So 1880 to 1900, that's a really, really big gap. That's 20 years, and a lot could happen in 20 years. So, yeah. So anyway, I did speak a little bit on some information I read about. Once again, I'm coming out of this book here, Indivisible African Native American Lives in the Americas. So I'm referring back to this book. In particular, the Blended Families, Blended Histories section. I'm looking at page 81. You can probably see my notes. Yeah, so I'm on page 81. I've read this several times, but I am just going to dive a little bit more into it. Now, in particular, from paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 on page 81, okay? During the census years 1870 to 1900, people were identified simply as white, black, or mulatto with few exceptions. One in the 1870 census, for example, was the identification of American Indian people as IND, or simply I, with no tribal affiliations attached. Until 1900, no regular census was conducted of the Indian populations. After that time, Indians were identified on a special Indian census schedule that occasionally noted mixed heritage. And voila, I found that record, and it's very interesting. In 1900, for example, many Indian families with African ancestry were identified simply as black. 10 years later, which is 1910, the same individuals were enumerated on the Indian census schedules. And then I'm going to drop down and read the third paragraph just to, give you a little background. The Indian census schedule captured many families whose members were of Indian and black ancestry. The special 1910 Indian census schedules listed the possible family mixtures as Indian, white, and Negro. On that form, the census enumerator made a mathematical calculation, in quotes, of Indian blood, a wholly inaccurate accounting of mixed heritage, but an important inclusion nonetheless. Mixed families from various states, including Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Mississippi, and Oklahoma, are included on the 1910 census. Now, I just wanted to put it out there. Now, this 1910 special Indian census record, it really focused on tribal communities that had at least 1,000 members. So if it was smaller tribes, they really didn't focus on them. But if it was 1,000 or more tribes, they were on the records, okay? For instance, with North Carolina, there's multiple tribal communities. We should know that by now, right? But in 1910, they focused on the Cherokee and the Tuscarora. And it's because it was more than 1,000 members or 1,000 tribal people within that community. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. Now, I will put the link down there in the description. I'll put a link to that actual document, 1910 Indian Census, Special Indian Census, okay? Also note that there are Native Americans who were taxed because they pretty much assimilated within the general population of white folks. And then there are those who weren't taxed, who stayed within their tribal communities and that identified with being whatever nation they're from. So they weren't necessarily on the tax records. So that's also an indication too, like, okay, if your ancestor is not on this particular census record, the 1910 special census record, then they may be on tax records. They're a Native American, but they didn't stay within their community, and they lived amongst the white folks. So that's another thing to also be aware of. And just so you know, I did learn with that 1890 census being, destroyed, there's other ways to find out information between 1880 and 1900. And so I learned that you can go to state census, for instance, like Ancestry.com. And if you go to the card catalog, you can look up state census records. And it depends on which state, and not all states are listed, but that can kind of help you out as well. Between the years 1885 and 1895. So if there's a brick wall for you, then you could possibly find the missing links within the state census records. I did look at North Carolina, and the only state census records they have is between 1784 and 1787. So if you're lucky enough to did your paper trail and you're now in the 1700s, that could definitely help you. Also, for us people with black blood, we do have Ancestry for the most part that were slaves. That's not excluding other ethnicities who were slaves as well. Like, there is documentation that Native Americans, small percentage, but they were also enslaved. Many were enslaved because they were enemies of other tribes and things of that nature. But for the most part, in this country, if you have a drop of black blood, they just threw you into the black category. So, many people know with tracing your African American or your black ancestry if they were slaves. Well, in those records, they didn't necessarily have their names attached to whatever the description was. Black male, 31, farmhand, or black female, 22, housekeeper. They didn't have their names. Definitely didn't have the full name. If they had a name, maybe it was their first name. However, if you go to the mortality records, and again, this is through Ancestry.com if you're doing it digitally, or I don't know what department or what building and what city you should go to get the information. But if you go to Ancestry.com, you go to the card catalog and you look up, or you just type in mortality, okay, just mortality, and then you break it down to the state, and then you break it down to the years, like 1890, mortality records, so 1850 to 1860 or 1850 to 1880 mortality records. Well, get this. Not only will they list a former or a person who was born into slavery, their first name, but they also have that last name. If that's not a gem in the rough, I don't know what is. A lot of people, including myself, trying to find our ancestry, and it's hard to find them because maybe their name in the record was a nickname and it really wasn't their name. They didn't have a last name attached to them because they were just documented like cattle. And to find that information in the mortality records, and it shows the person's full name. That's amazing. And that also includes folks that were listed as Indian or whatever like that. If they had the black blood, they, if there was a slave, mixed whatever, they kind of threw them in there with the blacks. And so that also can definitely be an eye-opener for other slaves, descendants of other slaves. So I thought that was awesome. The mortality records will show the first and the last name of that slave and what he or she did as a slave, be it a housemaid, a farmhand, whatever, a carpenter, whatever. So that was interesting. Again, when you're looking at the city directories, again through Ancestry.com, you can go to the card catalog. Again, to get to the card catalog, for those that don't know, if you're on the home page, you have that box that says search, and then a drop down, and then at the very bottom of that drop down it says card catalog, and then you can go from there. Just follow the prompts. My husband's calling me. Let's see. So anyway, you could go to the city directories, and then from there you can click on schools directories and church directories, and then you click on a city in the area, and then the country, and then the state, and that's how you can narrow it all down to that particular location. Not saying that it's complete, because no record is complete. There's always missing links, but it's just great that even though you hit that brick wall with the whole 1890 census thing, there's ways to get around that. And again, there's also ways to find out your ancestor who was a slave, his or her full name. And again, if you go to the mortality records, that will show their full name. And if that's not awesome, I don't know what is. Because everybody knows if you have black ancestry, be it mixed or not, it is very, very difficult to gather all this information. Why would it be easy, right? So, and also if, let's say, if the person was a slave, well, their slave master, if he or she had a really, really big, plantation, had a lot of farm hands and, just a lot of slaves, they tend to take better records. They tend to just do better keeping up with all the slaves and how much they cost, and also if they kept the same families within their plantation. So yeah, I thought that was awesome, like really awesome. Also, it's suggested to become a member of your local historical society. I found out about Virginia Historical Society. It's called Unknown No Longer. I kind of glanced at it a couple of years ago, but how sometimes you learn about something, it's just so overwhelming and you don't know where to start. You kind of like put it to the back burner. Well, I'm going to revisit that again because this is specifically Virginia, so that's good. One thing I do know about my family, as far as the black side, I do know that my maternal grandfather's people were pretty much black, like straight from West Africa type black folks. So I'm really trying to focus on that side of the family right now to try to understand their full names, try to get slave records and things of that nature. Someone was so nice enough to help me for free, and she was able to get me to find information about relatives that were born in like the early 1800s, like 1805, 1802. And so obviously if they were slaves, right, then I can definitely find a lot more information on them based on the mortality records and things of that nature. Now, just so you know, most of the mortality records are between the years of 1850 and 1880 or 1885. So if this person didn't die within that time period, obviously they wouldn't be on the mortality records, okay? So online digital records are great, but I see now that I'm definitely going to have to take field trips to actual locations, to actual departments in order to get like concrete information in hand and, you know, make copies and blah blah. But yeah, that definitely was a gem in the rough. Also, there's this society called African-American Historical and Genealogy Society, and that they pretty much focus on the black side of history. I would assume also people that are mixed with black, because again, especially in the state of Virginia, they just threw everybody into the black category, regardless if you're Native American or white and Native American or whatever, right? Okay, another thing that I wanted to really touch on with the 1910 special Indian census is that on page 38, let me drop down to page 38. Okay. It's titled Negro and Indian Mixed Bloods. Wow, right? And this is 1910. And coming from a state that only sees black or white, not Indian or not indigenous American, because as far as they're concerned, after 1835 or whatever, you were gone. You were no longer there as a Native American on paper, okay? But for this to be on paper, like I said, page 38, it says the distribution of the Negro and Indian mixed bloods is given in table 18. Obviously, you can go to the table and look at it for yourself. It says the number of Negro and Indian mixed bloods reported 2,255 is probably an understatement, owing to disinclination of admit Negro blood. That's sad. But yeah, 2,255 people who identify with being black and Native American based on this 1910 special Indian census. And it's written here that it's probably an understatement because people didn't want to admit that they had black blood, but whatever. It says of the number reported, 31.8% were less than half Negro, 32.3% half Indian, half Negro, and 34.6% more than half Negro, while for 1.3% the population of Negro blood was not reported. There's an unknown proportion that's listed. 29 people. 29 people with a percentage of 1.3 that has some kind of mixture of black and Native American, but they don't know. It's interesting, right?